myself, first of all, I'm Michael Mansfield, chairing the first session of 4 sessions of the Independent Healthcare Commission for North West London. And may I also introduce the 2 extra judges, as it were, on the panel. To my right, here is John Lister, Dr. John Lister, and to my left, Dr. Stephen Hurst. They're doctors in different fields, as you may be already aware. Just introducing the other personnel who are in front of me. To my right, standing up, is Katie Renston. She is, in fact, counsel to the inquiry. It's the normal way in which proceedings go. May I say straight away, these are quasi-judicial proceedings. Obviously, we haven't been imbued with the usual statutory authorities, but nevertheless, we're going to conduct ourselves as if we were a judicial inquiry. And so Katie Renston will be introducing the witnesses and also introducing their evidence, although they'll be giving it from just in front of me. To her left is Marcia Willis-Sturt from the Solicitors Burnboat, who instruct Katie, because we are independent of the councils who set this up. There would be no point in us just being mouthpieces of that, and we have a very specific task to do. And just on that, before Katie introduces the session today, we've got a timetable. We're starting a few minutes late to give people grace to get into the building and find this particular chamber. We're going through till 12:30 lunchtime. We have a lot to get through. We will have a mid-morning break. We may have to sort of judge it in terms of how we appear, or you appear, as if you need one. And obviously we will take one, 5-10 minutes. The questioning will not only be led by Katie Renston, but obviously we may have extra questions, and there'll be time for us to ask those, and so they'll be asked directly. And just finally this, it was clear to me when I was approached to do this particular job that if we're going to be independent, we ought to stand back a little bit. And there were 3 things. They're rather obvious questions that need to be asked, and I'm certainly focusing on these questions. I mean, the more detailed material clearly will come to light, but if you stand back, the 3 priorities seem to me to be: we need to identify, I'm going to call it the constituency. I don't mean the political constituency. I mean the demographic constituency of these particular boroughs, because they're all different. So we need to identify, who constitutes that hinterland in each of those areas, because they're different. Secondly, what are the needs of the people who live in that particular constituency? Because again, they will differ. And the third question, how are they best met? And of course that involves asking, are they being met at the moment? Will they be met by, for example, shaping a healthier future? So that's how we're approaching the task, but each of the 3 of us will have probably very different perspectives on the questions we want to ask. So having said that, may I call upon Council just to make some introductory remarks.
Thank you. Today's hearing, and those which will follow, form part of a commission of inquiry that has been jointly commissioned by the London boroughs of Brent, Ealing, Hounslow and Hammersmith and Fulham. The focus of these hearings, as you've heard, and of the commission as a whole, will be the long-term as well as the immediate impact of the Shaping a Healthier Future programme for the provision of health services, which is currently underway in North West London. The background to this is that in 2009, work began on a programme, the purpose of which was intended to shape a strategy to provide sustainable, high-quality health services throughout the region. The premise upon which this work was commenced was that there was a pressing need for change based on the increasing healthcare demands of a rising and ageing population, and that there was unacceptable variation in levels of service across and within the region's hospitals and other facilities. It was said that to do nothing was not an option. In late 2011, this work evolved into the Shaping a Healthier Future programme. There then ensued a pre-consultation phase, during the course of which the bodies involved in the process gathered information and arrived at a series of what they considered to be the possible options for change. These were then whittled down to 3 potential options, which became the subject of a public consultation in July 2012. The broad thrust of the proposals presented for consultation were that whilst 5 of the 9 hospitals in the region were to continue to provide the full range of services, including accident and emergency facilities, the remaining 4 were to adopt reduced or more specialist roles. The changes to acute hospital services were to be offset by the development of enhanced out-of-hospital provision and other associated services. The 3 options presented for consultation were all variations of this plan, with the stated benefits envisaged being those of increased quality of care, improved access to care, and cost benefits. In February 2013, the decision-making business plan setting out the projected costs and the cost benefits of the proposal was published, and the Joint Committee of the Primary Care Trusts, which was the then decision-making body, approved the programme. Over the course of the consultation, and following the adoption of the proposal subsequently chosen, there ensued a considerable degree of controversy, which generated a number of reviews and reports in which divergent views were expressed about both the decision-making processes and the substance of the programme itself. Following a formal referral by the Adult Services Arm of the London Borough of Ealing in March 2013, a review was undertaken by the Independent Reconfiguration Panel at the behest of the Secretary of State. Although identifying some areas of uncertainty and making some recommendations, the Reconfiguration Panel broadly endorsed the proposals for change. Implementation of the proposals then began and has, since mid-2014, been in the process of being rolled out across the region. By December 2014, when this commission was established, a number of key events, including the closure of the accident and emergency departments at Hammersmith and Central Middlesex hospitals, the opening of the new accident and emergency facilities at Northwick Park Hospital, and the merger of the North West London and Ealing Hospital Trusts had taken place. Further significant changes are taking place on a continuing basis, with perhaps the most obvious current issue being the planned closure of the maternity facilities at Ealing Hospital, a decision about which, until very recently, we understood it was to be taken this week. That has now been subject to further delay. The purpose of this commission is to engage in a transparent, open-minded exchange with all interested parties, to examine the decisions made thus far, and to look afresh at whether those decisions and the plans arising from them are indeed those that are best able to provide the optimum available healthcare and linked social care services to the residents of this region. Or, if upon fresh examination, there are other alternatives which might be as good or better and which merit exploration. Given that the implementation of Shaping a Healthier Future is well underway and that many of the plan changes are already in midstream, the emphasis of these hearings will be on the aspects identified by the commissioning boroughs as being of the most immediate and most critical importance to the residents of the region. It will surprise no one that chief amongst these are the changes to A&E and acute services, the closure of the maternity unit in Ealing, the perceived lack of progress in provision of out-of-hospital services, and the financing of the programme. The Commissioners are, as you've heard, keen that the voices of as many of the individuals or organisations that wish to be heard in the process can be. So, with that in mind, and with the permission of the witnesses, the Commissioners, may I now call Mr. Andy Slaughter as the first witness. Do remain seated, Mr. Slaughter. This is not a formal court and therefore no need to stand. Could I ask you, please, first of all, to give your full name and your professional address to the Commissioners?
Yes, my name is Andy Slaughter. I'm the Labour MP for Hammersmith and with my business address at House of Commons, London, SW1AOAA.
Now, you should have in front of you, right at the bottom of that pile of ring binders, a bundle labelled Volume 5.
Yeah.
And the very last document in that bundle, at page 1741, should be your submission.
Yes.
Could I just ask if you could kindly keep your voice up?
Yeah, indeed.
It's not bad, but I think I'm quite softly spoken on occasion. I don't know whether that's working or not.
Okay.
I think nobody's quite sure whether the mic actually works to amplify or record, but
what
do you want to tell it?
I'll speak loudly in any event.
Yes. Sorry, it's just that.
Thank you. Is that statement true to the best of your knowledge and understanding?
It is.
And do you wish it to stand as your evidence to the Commission?
I do.
I'd like to ask you first, very briefly, about the consultation phase. You were the MP at the point that the consultation was taking place. If we turn please to paragraph 8 of your statement, what you say there is that in your view there was no genuine intent to engage with the public. How would you characterise the consultation process?
Yes, I think the process here is quite revealing about the substantive proposals as well. And I'll try not to take too long, but if I could perhaps just briefly set out my experience, because I've also been following this from June, July 2012, when the original proposals were published. They clearly had, and you mentioned in opening that there had been a pre-consultation phase, but I think that had been relatively low key, and I think it was a surprise when the McKinsey documents, which were only made available on the day they were published, and these were several very large volumes, at the meeting of what was then the Joint Committee of Primary Care Trusts at Central Hall, Westminster, took many people by surprise because of the radical nature of the proposals. There then followed, between then and February 2013, what purported to be a public consultation process, which I think that, and I'm reflecting here, I think the general view, certainly of my constituents and my own experience, was a box-ticking exercise which did its best to minimise the opposition, and that ranged from, well, I had my own experience of being quoted as saying that I had myself been consulted at an early stage and had given an opinion through another MP at a meeting which I didn't attend, which was completely false. To the fact that petitions with several thousands, I think in fact somebody had several tens of thousands of signatures, opposing significant parts of the proposal in shaping a healthier future, were treated as one representation. So they would have counted alongside one person who had filled in the standard questionnaire, even though there might be 20 or 30,000 people who had signed that petition. And one of the reasons why people preferred to sign petitions or to write their own letters or to sign their own petitions was because the questionnaires and the way the process was carried out was seen to be biased. It was seen to push people towards a particular view.
Can I ask you then to encapsulate whether or not you were able to form a view as to whether information about the proposals and the consultation reached all groups of your constituents?
No, there was an original promise, I think, that all households, and we are here talking about, not such how many households, we're talking about 2 million people within the catchment area of 9 hospitals, would receive a leaflet of some kind through the door. That, without informing anyone that a change had been made, it was then decided, I think it was still the Joint Committee PCTs, that that would be too expensive to do, and therefore that was not done. And therefore the only way that constituents were informed, unless they were informed by campaigning groups, was through online methods or through advertisements in local papers which don't have a very high circulation.
Are there any particular groups of constituents that, in your view, the news of the consultation did not reach?
Well, the reality is, this may sound surprising, it reached very few constituents. And I think it took well beyond the close of the public consultation process, probably into late 2013, early 2014, before there was a general awareness amongst the population. I can only really speak for Hammersmith here, but it may well be true elsewhere. Understood the magnitude or the nature of the proposals. However, I think to answer your question more directly, those groups who did not have online access, who were not receiving perhaps communications or were not sufficiently computer literate to do that, those groups who would find it difficult to understand information because perhaps they had English as a second language, perhaps were elderly, were more likely, in my experience, not to have understood what was happening. But it was a general malaise.
Now, just moving on, please, to paragraph 9. You refer there to constituents frequently mentioning to you, feelings of being disregarded. Can I ask you whether that comment relates just to the consultation period, or is that something which is still continuing?
I think, and I have to say, part of that experience is not just my ordinary job as an MP, which obviously brings me into contact with constituents on a daily basis, but through actively participating in the campaign, which meant certainly up until very recently, spending a couple of hours every Saturday talking to constituents in Central Hammersmith about this, as part of the awareness raising exercise that Sarah Hospitals had done, that people felt that decisions had been made and that their opinions it was almost not worth bothering, because decisions had been made and they were going to go ahead, and hospitals were going to close or services were going to shut down, and there was little that could be done about it.
I want to move on to consider Hammersmith Hospital. Now, of course, the accident and emergency was shut on the 10th of September 2014. Could I ask you just to have a look, and you'll see volume 2 in front of you. And what I'm going to take you to is a letter from Dr. Tim Spicer, who is the chair of the Hammersmith and Fulham Clinical Commissioning Group. I'm just going to ask you to comment for your views on some of the things that are said in that letter, if you don't mind. You'll find it's at page 585 of that bundle.
Yes, I have that.
If you turn on to page 589, what you can see there is that Dr. Spicer is setting out the reasons for the closure of the A&E department at Hammersmith Hospital. And what he says in brief terms is that the emergency department was small, there weren't enough senior clinicians, and there were difficulties in recruitment, and in essence, he says it was unsafe.
Yeah.
And that's reiterated elsewhere, and I won't take you to it, but what he says is that because of that, it took priority over the original plans to keep Hammersmith open, the A&E open, until the out-of-hospital service had been put in place. Can I ask you please to comment on that analysis as to whether or not the safety issue was in fact correct?
Well, that's an argument that was raised both in relation to Hammersmith and Central Middlesex. Indeed, the Central Middlesex A&E was closed, became not a 24-hour service. It was a daytime only service, and that was the reason that was given. And various explanations were given as to either the level of cover, the ability to recruit staff, or the level of the competence, but the level of qualification of staff at Hammersmith and Central Middlesex. And that seemed often to be a self-fulfilling prophecy, which is to say, and the same fears which surrounded Hammersmith and Central Middlesex now surround Charing Cross, which is to say that the certainty with which it was stated from day one on the Shaping Healthy Future programme that these A&E departments would be closing meant that it became obviously more difficult to recruit staff, that the organisation saw less reason to invest in them in that way, and therefore I don't feel I have a clinical knowledge to say on a day-to-day basis what was the level of competence or staffing at a particular A&E department. But I think it's indicative of the poor way in which the process has been handled, that by Dr. Spicer's own admission, that closures were happening earlier than was desirable because, in their own terms, services were not up to scratch. I have to say my own constituents' experience is that they value the service at Hammersmith Hospital. It serves one of the poorest communities in the country, and I have had very few, if any, complaints about the service there.
I also want to ask you about another issue that he raises. He states that there is a 24-hour emergency care centre now open at Hammersmith Hospital, and that there is a route for transferring any emergency treatment which can't be handled there at either St Mary's or Charing Cross or Chelsea and Westminster. First of all, can you help us with any information you've got about the operation of that urgent care centre? What does it do, and what are your constituents saying about it?
Well,
briefly, if you will,
yes.
only because of the
yes,
time
it's slightly more complicated than that, because there is emergency cardiac facilities at Hammersmith, and indeed blue light emergencies are still diverted there. So
Could I ask you to put your microphone on, because I gather there's a difficult...
Yes.
Yes.
So it is slightly more complicated, and part of the confusion of people still not knowing what services are available at what hospital, that includes road signs being still up after the closure of the A&E saying there wasn't A&E there, and the way that the public relations exercise around the closure went, which refused to use the word closure and just said that services are changing, means that there is no certainty among people as to where to go for care. But my understanding is clear that the urgent care centre there does not have any emergency consultant cover. It has either GP or nursing cover, and it effectively provides the same services as urgent care or walk-in centres anywhere else.
Now, that being the case, do you have an understanding about there being any transfer arrangements in place for patients who need to move on to A&E?
Well, all I can say about that is that clearly, as it is a 24-hour service, if someone arrived at any point, and I say that advisedly because I know that elsewhere there have been tragedies where individuals have gone to A&Es, urgent care centres which work 24 hours, and there's been a delay in transfer. I am assuming, as a simple administrative process, that if someone arrives and is unable to be treated there, then an ambulance will be called and they will be taken probably to St Mary's. But I don't know any process beyond that.
Finally on that, can I ask you just to comment on the conclusion that Dr Spicer draws that the changes at Hammersmith Hospital have resulted in a safe and sustainable urgent care centre for local residents?
I am talking on a daily and weekly basis to residents living in the Old Oak, White City areas who are the immediate catchment areas of the hospital. They are not just extremely unhappy, they are extremely worried that they no longer have adult emergency service, they no longer have an A&E that is accessible to them. Very low car ownership, very high levels of chronic illness and disability in that area. I find that an extraordinarily complacent statement. I think he should also look at what the knock-on effect has been to the surrounding A&Es, including Charing Cross, post the closure on the 10th of September.
Can we in fact now turn to Charing Cross? Now, obviously there's a plan to reconfigure Charing Cross site. Can you help us with your view about whether the demolition of the existing buildings is necessary or not?
The existing buildings, which I well remember being built some 40 years ago, there have from time to time been statements about their what remedial work will need to be done, and it may well be that is the case in relation to a building that's 40 years old. But it is a purpose-built hospital. It's one of the largest hospitals in London. It is only 40 years old. As far as I'm aware, there is, other than the what is in Shaping a Healthier Future, i.e. the plan for the reconfiguration of services, there is no reason to demolish that building. Indeed, it formed part of the assessment as part of the options as to whether that building could be retained, albeit to provide only the primary and other care services which Shaping a Healthier Future envisages.
Now, in relation to the facilities which are said to be put in place, can you just briefly give us your view of the impact of the reduction in beds proposed?
Well, the impact in inpatient beds, there are other beds, but inpatient beds, which is the primary concern, is of over 90%. There will be some increase of beds, we understand, at Chelsea and Westminster and St Mary's, but there will still be a net loss of several hundred beds.
And in relation to the loss of the hyperacute stroke unit, which is moving to St Mary's,
which has been rated the best in the country, which works very well on that location, and it is a good location in the catchment area it serves, going way up into West London. In terms of travel time, is important. If it moves to St Mary's, even assuming there is no loss of service there, it still is greatly to the detriment of those who live in my constituency and further out.
And in relation to the closure of Charing Cross accident emergency in its current form,
yes.
Whether it's consultant-led or GP-led, if it becomes an urgent care centre, is it your view that it will fulfil the need of local residents?
Absolutely not, and this is the crucial point, and the obfuscation around this point, I think is one of the most troubling aspects, and that goes right up to the Secretary of State and beyond, in terms of using phrases such as an A&E in some, albeit of a different shape or size. It is very clear from the proposals put forward at the moment that whatever it is called, whether it's called emergency department, a type 3 A&E or an urgent care centre, that there is no emergency consultant cover on site. And specifically, when I asked the question, what differences could there be between the emergency department on the Charing Cross site under the Chenghouse Health Future and an urgent care centre, I was given only three differences. One is that there would be 24-hour GP cover, because 24-hour GP cover is not guaranteed at urgent care centres, and there would be X-ray facilities there. And there would be some, although I think it's a particular feature of the Charing Cross site, there would be some recuperation beds, so that if elderly people came and were treated, had effectively outpatient treatment, but could stay in for a day or two rather than going home, not features of ordinary urgent care centres. But beyond that, there's nothing which would associate this with what an A&E department would do.
Now, just very briefly, thinking about the financial implications, the suggestion is that there are financial benefits to be gained from the sale of the freed up land. What's your view of the benefit that will bring, presuming that funding goes back to Imperial College Health Trust and the NHS?
Well, this is a material aspect in which the plans have changed and which there's been no further consultation, which is the original plan was to clear the entire site at Charing Cross, I understand it, save for possibly some query over the buildings that Imperial don't own. Now, part of the land will be retained to build a new primary care and other facilities, and the additional capital receipt will come from the sale of 50% of the St Mary's site. Some estimates have been made of what that receipt will be, and they're substantial sums of money, although they do seem to me, knowing the property market, hopefully that they're on the low side. Clearly that is an important part of Imperial Healthcare Trust's development strategy, their site strategy, and it was a significant change that was never consulted on, never advertised, between the publication in February 2013 of the proposals for the future of the Charing Cross site, which were in the hands of the CCG, and what effectively happened thereafter, which is that Imperial took over and its blueprint for the site is now what is going forward. They both involve a loss of emergency consultant services, but the actual land use and configuration of what goes on the site is very different, and that's never been consulted on.
I just want to look at the other side of the coin very briefly, because the other side of the coin to the reduction of acute services is the improvement of provision of new primary services. On the information you have, can you give us, in a nutshell, what you think the state of the GP services in your constituency is at the moment?
Well, we have very good GPs in the constituency. We have had traditionally we have the problem that there are a number of older premises, sole practitioners, and we've tried slowly and gradually to move towards larger units, like the new Parkview Centre that's opened, like the Park Medical Centre, and so on and so forth. However, those services are under severe pressure, as they are elsewhere, and waiting times for appointment are substantial, and there are substantial additional pressures, and they may come from nursing homes, they may come from elderly population, they may come from the fact that there are very strong ill health indicators in the population here, and they are unable to cope.
What would your view be of the impact of them taking on an increased role?
Well, I just don't think they're, and I'm not even sure that the health service is pretending that they are able to do that. The only change that there has been in recent months is that I think 4 surgeries are now offering either late evening or weekend appointments. That has been introduced at short notice in response to the closure, I think, of Hammersmith and Central Middlesex. of course it's to be welcomed. We welcome any increased hours that GPs are open, but it is a firefighting operation.
I wanted to ask you about that because in fact Dr. Spicer, and this is at page 586 of the bundle there, talks about the investment in primary care as being in the sum of 4.45 million, setting up of 7-day-a-week GP surgeries, organising access to clinical specialists and investing in mental health services and integrated health and social care initiatives. And I wondered if you were just able to comment briefly, and I think you've already started to in some ways, on whether or not on the ground you've seen any changes as a result of those initiatives.
I haven't seen any. I welcome that investment, I welcome those improvements, but they are pretty de minimis compared with the proposals that are being taken forward. They are only happening now after some closures have already taken place. And I think that would be conceded that this is all happening rather late in the day. And they don't address the central concerns, which is that the capacity needed for A&E services is there. The problems with social care, pressure on social care are there. And the pressure on GP services are there. And none of those matters are being addressed. I mean, it's a moot point as to whether, even if all those issues were addressed, you would still be able to go ahead with the degree of reduction in A&E services. I don't think you would, and I think that is the view that's been expressed by the College of Emergency Medicine. And I think the model we have here, which is that you have GPs, urgent care, and type 1 A&E co-located at Charing Cross, is the best model to use, and the primary problem is one of capacity.
And finally, can I just ask you, what's your view about what should happen now?
I wish I could press a button and Charing Health Future would disappear entirely, and because I believe it is an entirely faulted process that has been partly cost-driven, and certainly it is based on very shaky clinical evidence, and has disregarded public opinion throughout, and indeed other opinion. We are where we are. At the minimum, what I would ask for is a full, independent clinical review of the process and a proper public consultation. Neither of those, I would have thought, essential facts have taken place throughout this period, and that makes it, in the end, an entirely faulted period. And we've now reached the stage where, possibly because there's a general election very close to, really it is impossible to get answers from anybody up to and including government level. We are still waiting the NHS England inquiry into the closures of that took place in September. We're still awaiting part 2 of KEO, which was supposed to justify the shaping healthier future model for the whole country. And I think in the absence of a sound clinical or methodology, that it's dangerous and quite wrong to push ahead with these proposals. It's simply treating my constituents as guinea pigs.
Thank you. Would you like to just wait there? There may be questions from the commissioners.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I've got a number of questions which I think we're going to get in the next 6 minutes. But the first one really is an observation I'd like to make on behalf of the Commission in relation to something you've just said. Namely, I think we are extremely concerned about the fact that it appears that the run-up to an election is making it difficult to obtain materials, documents and answers to questions that we are asking. We do not wish to be in a position at the end of the day when we issue a report that we're going to be told, oh well, you didn't have all the information. So the answer to that is we're not being given all the information. So we're very concerned about that, and I would just, on behalf of the Commission, issue an urgent request to those who know, please to provide materials so that the public may know what it is we're basing our opinions on. So that's, I'm sorry to say, just an observation. The second observation is, I didn't at the beginning make it obvious, but it probably is, that as Commissioners we do have reports and statements from all witnesses, including this one, some of which obviously we won't be able to hear, and we will just read. But my main question relates to paragraph number 11 in your statement, I'm going to read just a sentence in case others haven't got it, although these all will be made available. And this is how you put it. We are trying to implement major changes on a system that is currently broken, and on organisations which in many cases have gone through repeated management change and which suffer from high staff turnover and low staff morale. So the question is this, relates to that part of the observation about a system that is currently broken. Now, I think one of the observations put in the opening was doing nothing is not an option. So really, what is, if the system is broken for whatever reason in the past, how is it going to be mended? Is it yet more consultation as you've suggested, or is there something beyond the consultation which you see should be the objective here?
It's absolutely right. I would just say that I do that paragraph by praising the job that the staff are doing. I want to put that on record because I make no criticism of the nursing and other clinical staff who are coping, I think, with an extraordinarily difficult situation. To answer your question, there is agreement, I think, between all parties that a number of the proposals within that are in Shaping a Healthy Future, or which are implied by that, are sound principles. Integration of health and social care, the ability to try and end what terrible term I know, bed blocking, the ability to try and triage better so that people go to the appropriate type of emergency service in that way. And a lot of good work is done on that. The difficulty is that the way that Shaping a Healthy Future is being implemented it militates against that in many aspects. For example, the loss of the majority of inpatient beds at Charing Cross is clearly not going to help the situation with A&E services, because a large part of the problems with A&E are people who have to be admitted, but there are beds that are not available to go into. Equally, some firefighting increases in GP services are not going to provide the alternative, insofar as it's applicable, in primary care services. So I think there are two things happening with Shaping a Healthy Future. Firstly, insofar as it's right, it's not doing what it says it should do, but also, and the elephant in the room really is, its basic premise, which is that you can have this huge reduction in A&E services, and this huge centralisation in A&E services is not in any way proven, and therefore that's what we have to look at again. And what we're going to come up with, I think, at the end of that, is yes, an increase in community services, yes, an integration of health and social care, and yes, hopefully, a better integration of primary and hospital services, but still maintaining a sufficiency, both in terms geographically and in terms of capacity of A&E services.
Other thinking, I have another one, I'm afraid. So it relates to triage in a sense. If I'm a member of the public and I have an urgent situation in the middle of the night, this is related to urgent care centres. Is there some kind of standard criteria? What is an urgent care centre? How do I know where I've got to go? And who's going to be there? And what are the criteria? It seems very fluid.
It's a huge... I gave some of the anecdotal stories about road signs and notice and consultation process. It is a huge problem. People get to know, even there have been significant changes before. For example, paediatric emergency care was moved from Hammersmith Hospital to St Mary's about 15 years ago. I still find people who are just getting used to that as a change. Changes of that kind take a long time to bed in. The terms of art, or sometimes the terms of public relations that are used by the health service bodies, don't mean anything to people, which is why people at the moment do not know where to go, and therefore they will, to a large extent, continue to go where they've always gone. So people who have serious, be they chronic or acute conditions, will still walk into the urgent care centre at Hammersmith. And I worry about the level of care that people will receive as a consequence of that. And that's not to be rude to the people who run urgent care centres, but they do not have the same resources or the same degree of qualification as those who are available in A&E departments. And I think that the bottom line is that people are going to get a second-class service, particularly poorer people, particularly people who are less mobile, because they will not think, right, what I need to do now is get a taxi or get on a bus or a couple of buses and go to St Mary's, because then I will get the full range of treatment. I'm just going to go to Hammersmith Hospital as I've always done to see what happens.
Well, I mean, just you talked right at the beginning. We talked about access to information about this in terms of the consultation. I do seem to recall there were some specific points were made about the availability of translations of the proposals and the extent to which the full detail of the proposals were translated and made available to minority. Would you like to add something on that?
Well, I think that the point I made about the failure to inform all households. This is it's described by the NHS themselves as the biggest ever reorganisation programme in the history of the NHS. The idea that you don't inform the people who use those services, even putting a leaflet through people's doors with the availability of explaining how people, whether they, it may be people with a disability or people who have English second language, how if they can't access that information there, how they then access it. I just found extraordinary. I think it said a lot about the fact that decisions had already been made and opinions were not really being sought.
Well, I've got one final question. I'm sorry, we're overrun by a little bit, but we start at 11. One of the things I'm interested in, I think we're all interested in, and you would be in a prime position to help, is if one looked at your constituency, and I mean in that sense your political constituency as well as medical, how would you describe the needs of that constituency? I know this is a global question, but what type of constituency is it? And what is it that needs to be met in that constituency?
Well, perhaps the defining points for the purposes of today are almost 50% of my constituents are born outside the UK. Although it has very wealthy pockets, it also has some of the most deprived areas of the UK contained within it. It has high levels, according to census data, of chronic illnesses, things like diabetes, HIV, and it has a lot of people with I call multiple health problems who need a lot of attention from and often attention that can only be provided at consultant level. Which is not to say that lots of GPs don't do a very good job, but there are acute health needs there. And the other significant factor is there is a turnover of variously estimated between a quarter and a third of the population a year, which means that people, far more so than other parts of the country, even other parts of London, people are not registered with GPs. If they do fall ill, then their point of recourse is the accident emergency department. Now that is one reason why urgent care and indeed GP services are available at the accident emergency department, or were, because we're trying to anticipate that problem. There's nothing you can do about that. You can't stop that population mobility. A lot of it will be, for example, poorer people seeking low-paid jobs, migrant communities of that kind. Their healthcare needs must be met, and it is both more expensive and it requires a different type of response to a very stable community where people will go through a more orthodox process of simply going to their GP and being referred on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very grateful.